the spring of 1906, the United States Army Corps of Engineers detonated a controlled series of charges along the eastern rim of the American Falls at Niagara, New York. The official record describes it as a routine survey operation, a temporary diversion of water to inspect the bedrock shelf for erosion damage. The water was rerouted away from a section of the falls for 11 days. Crews went down. They mapped what they found. And then the water was returned. The report was filed with the War Department, and for reasons that took me a long time to understand, the physical findings of that survey were never published in any newspaper, never entered into the public record of Army Corps proceedings for that year, and are not mentioned in any of the standard histories of Niagara Falls written before 1970. The report itself exists. I have read it. And what the crews found on the dry riverbed in those 11 days was not what anyone had expected to find there. I came to this sideways, the way I come to most of these things. I was working through the Corps of Engineers Project Archives at the National Archives Facility in College Park, Maryland, trying to piece together the sequence of federal decisions that shaped the Niagara Power Corridor between 1895 and 1920. The period when Nikola Tesla's alternating current system was first harnessed at the falls, and when the large private power companies were establishing the contracts that would define American electrical infrastructure for the next 100 years. I was looking at franchise agreements, easement documents, the standard bureaucratic machinery of industrial development on federal water. And in a folder that had been misfiled under a project designation for a different fall survey, the one conducted in 1901, I found a report bearing the date of June 1906, and a classification marking I had not seen before on Corps documents from that period. Not secret in the modern sense. A designation used briefly in the early 20th century that roughly translated, in the administrative language of that era, 2. Internal distribution only, not for press release. By the time you reach the end of what I'm going to tell you, you will understand that what they found beneath the water at Niagara in 1906 was not a geological curiosity. It was evidence, structural, physical, datable evidence, of construction that predated every settlement in the region by a margin that the engineers in that survey did not know how to account for, and that the men who received their report did not know how to disclose. The question I could not stop asking, once I understood what the report described, was not whether this had been covered up. That part became obvious once I traced the chain of custody. The question was why the men who covered it up genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. Because I think some of them did, and that belief is, in some ways, the most unsettling part of all of this. Consider what the Niagara Gorge actually is, geologically, before any of this begins. The falls themselves have been moving. Not metaphorically, physically moving, upstream, cutting through the Niagara escarpment at a rate that geologists in 1906 estimated at somewhere between 3 and 5 feet per year. The gorge below the falls is the record of that retreat, a canyon carved by the falls themselves over thousands of years as they chewed backward through the limestone cap. The Army Corps engineers who went down in 1906 understood this. They were not geologists by training, most of them, but they had been briefed on the basics before the survey began. They knew they would be walking on bedrock that had been cut by water. They knew the shelf they were inspecting had been the floor of the river for a very long time before the water deepened around it. What they were not prepared for was the masonry. There is a section of the 1906 Corps report, beginning on page 14 of the original document and running for approximately 6 pages, that describes in careful engineering language a series of structural features on the dry gorge floor that the survey team initially assumed were natural. Columnar limestone formations, perhaps, or the remnants of ancient glacial deposition. The language is technical and hedged, the way engineering language always is when the writer is genuinely uncertain. But by page 17, the hedging stops. The senior surveyor, a man named Captain Elias Thurber, wrote a passage that I have read perhaps 40 times since I found it, and I still find it difficult to read at normal pace. He writes, "The formations in grid sections C7 through C11 do not conform to natural geological process as understood by this team or by the geological consultants we have contacted subsequent to the initial survey. The regularity of the spacing, the evidence of dressed surface on the larger units, and the presence of what appears to be a continuous linear arrangement running approximately northeast to southwest, for a distance we estimate at no less than 220 feet. These features are inconsistent with the formation of this gorge by natural hydraulic action. We are not in a position to offer an alternative explanation. Not in a position to offer an alternative explanation." That sentence in an Army Corps report filed in 1906. And that is the part I keep returning to. Because Thurber was not a man given to dramatic language, I pulled his personnel file. I found 3 other survey reports he authored between 1898 and 1910. They are precise economical documents. He measured things and described what he measured. He did not editorialize. The passage on page 17 is the only place in his entire professional record where he wrote a sentence that admitted the limits of what he could explain, which means that whatever he saw in sections C7 through C11 of the Niagara Gorge floor was something that his training, his experience, and his professional instinct all told him he could not name. And he was honest enough to put that in writing. The report describes the masonry, and by page 19, Thurber is using that word without qualification, as consisting of stones that he estimates at between 400 and 900 pounds each, dressed on at least 2 faces, laid in a pattern that suggested deliberate coursing rather than random deposition. He notes that several of the stones bore what he describes as tooling marks, striations that ran parallel to the dressed face and that were inconsistent with glacial scratching, which tends to run in the direction of ice movement rather than perpendicular to the stone's own surface. He describes the linear arrangement as resembling, in its general configuration, a foundation course, the lowest visible layer of a structure that once rose above it. He does not speculate about what rose above it. He simply describes what was there, measures what he can measure, and closes the section by noting that the full extent of the arrangement could not be determined because portions of it extended beneath sections of bedrock that the partial diversion had not uncovered. The question of who saw this report is traceable because the Corps maintained routing slips, paper records of which offices received which documents. The 1906 survey was routed to exactly 4 destinations: the office of the Chief of Engineers in Washington, the War Department's Bureau of Insular Affairs, which had no obvious jurisdictional connection to a domestic river survey, and whose inclusion I have not been able to explain, the Regional Corps District Office in Buffalo, and a 4th office whose name on the routing slip has been partially obscured by what appears to be deliberate ink cancellation at some point after the document was filed. I can make out 2 letters of that office name. I have shown the image to 3 archivists. None of them has been able to reconstruct the full name with confidence. The Buffalo District Office responded. Their response is in the same folder, dated 3 weeks after the survey report. It is a single paragraph, signed by the district engineer, and it says that the findings described in sections C7 through C11 of the survey report have been reviewed, and that no further action is recommended at this time, pending additional geological consultation. There is no record of that geological consultation ever taking place. No follow-up survey was conducted at the relevant sections. No geologist's letter is in the file. and the next survey of the Niagara Gorge floor, conducted by the Army Corps, the one done in 1931, when a different section of the falls was partially dewatered to address a different erosion problem, does not reference the 1906 report at all, not as prior work, not as context. It proceeds as if the 1906 survey had never happened. Consider what was happening at Niagara in the years immediately surrounding 1906, because the timing matters more than anything else in the story. The Niagara Falls Power Company had been operating since 1895, when it threw the switch on the first large-scale alternating current generating station in American history, built on Tesla's patents, licensed to Westinghouse. By 1906, there were 2 major generating stations on the American side and a third under construction on the Canadian side. The falls were no longer a natural wonder. They were a power plant, controlled by a small group of investors, J.P. Morgan's financial interests substantially represented, as were those of the Vanderbilt family and the Astor Group, who had an enormous financial stake in the public perception of Niagara as a geological feature and nothing more. Because what sits beneath a geological feature is geology, not legally complicated. But what sits beneath evidence of prior human construction of unknown age and unknown origin is something else entirely. A jurisdictional question. A historical question, potentially a legal question involving indigenous land rights, which in 1906 were already the subject of ongoing federal treaty disputes with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, whose ancestral territory included every inch of the Niagara Corridor. I am not telling you that Morgan or Vanderbilt personally buried this report. I do not have evidence of that. What I am telling you is that the men who received that routing slip in 1906 understood the context in which the findings would land, and that the institutional decision, whether made by one person or by the collective weight of bureaucratic caution, was to file the report internally and commission no further investigation. The question of who made that decision is the one I have not been able to fully answer. What I have been able to answer is what they decided. There is a second document. This one I found not in the federal archives, but in the estate papers of a Niagara Falls, New York attorney named Gerald Wentworth Post, who practiced in the city from 1891 until his death in 1944. And whose office files were donated by his grandson to the Niagara Falls Public Library in 1971. Post was not a famous man. He handled property transactions, business incorporations, the ordinary legal work of a mid-sized industrial city. But in 1908, 2 years after the Corps survey, he was retained by a group of men he identifies in his billing records only as the Goat Island Interests. A reference, I eventually determined, to a coalition of landholders and business operators on Goat Island, the strip of land that divides the American Falls from the Horseshoe Falls on the Canadian side. These men had commissioned their own private survey of portions of the gorge accessible from the island's lower terraces. They were not trying to replicate the Corps findings. They did not know about the Corps findings. As far as I can determine, they were looking for something much more specific. They wanted to know whether the bedrock beneath Goat Island could support an expanded carriage road and tourist infrastructure without risk of collapse. What Post's files contain is a surveyor's letter, written by a man named Orville Chase of Buffalo, dated August 1908, describing what he found when he accessed the lower terrace on the American side from a point about 300 feet upstream of the position Thurber had identified 2 years earlier. Chase was not looking for masonry. He was looking at load-bearing capacity, but he found something that stopped him, and he wrote about it in his letter to Post, with the careful precision of a man who did not want to be accused of inventing what he was describing. He writes that in a section of exposed gorge wall approximately 15 feet above the current water line, a section exposed because the water level in 1908 was slightly lower than usual due to the volume being diverted to the power intakes. He observed what he describes as a horizontal course of fitted stone, uniform in dimension, running along the wall face for a distance of at least 60 feet before disappearing into the water at one end and into a rock fall at the other. He notes that the stone is of a type he does not recognize as native to the Niagara escarpment geology. He notes that the fitting is, in his words, of a quality inconsistent with any construction technique he is aware of from the indigenous or European settlement periods of the region. He does not say what period he thinks it might be from. He does not offer a date. He says only that it is old, by which he seems to mean older than anything he has a reference point for, and that he does not know how to account for it in the context of a load-bearing assessment for a carriage road. He recommends, at the end of the letter, that Post's clients consult a historian before proceeding with any construction that might disturb the gorge wall in that section. Post's files contain no follow-up letter. No historian was apparently consulted. The carriage road project was eventually abandoned, not, as far as I can tell, for reasons connected to Chase's letter, but because the funding collapsed in the financial contraction of 1907. The letter was folded into the billing file for the Goat Island interests account and remained there, unread, for 63 years. The question is not whether these two surveys were describing the same construction. They were not describing identical features. The gorge floor and the gorge wall are different surfaces. But they were describing the same zone of the American Falls corridor, separated by perhaps 300 feet of horizontal distance and 15 to 20 feet of vertical elevation, and both were describing fitted stonework of indeterminate age and uncertain origin. Two independent observers, 2 years apart, neither aware of the other, arriving at the same edge of the same explanation. I cannot account for this. This is the part I keep returning to. Because the standard narrative of Niagara, the one taught in schools, the one on the interpretive signs, the one repeated in every tourism brochure published since the 1890s, treats the gorge as a natural system and nothing more. A product of glacial retreat, post-glacial flooding, and the steady hydraulic erosion of the retreating falls. That narrative is not wrong. The gorge is all of those things, but the standard narrative has always assumed that the gorge floor and walls contain nothing inconsistent with natural geological process. And two separate surveys, in 2 separate years, by 2 separate teams with no knowledge of each other, found features that contradicted that assumption. And neither finding was published, not in 1906, not in 1908, not in 1931 when the Corps returned to the gorge and failed to mention what Thurber had documented. The Haudenosaunee oral traditions regarding Niagara are not silent on this. Anthropologists working with Haudenosaunee knowledge holders in the 1930s and 1940s recorded references to structures at Niagara understood to predate even the earliest oral memory of Haudenosaunee settlement in the region, structures described as already ruins by the time the people arrived. Those records are in the collections of the Smithsonian's National Anthropological Archives. They are not cited in any of the engineering or geological literature on the Niagara Gorge. Not once. I am not in a position to tell you what was built at the base of Niagara Falls, or when, or by whom. Precision is the only thing that separates what I am describing from speculation. What I can tell you is what the documents say. An Army Corps of Engineers survey in 1906 found dressed, coursed masonry on the gorge floor that its lead surveyor stated was inconsistent with natural geological formation. A private surveyor in 1908 found a course of fitted stone in the gorge wall he described as inconsistent with any construction technique from any period of settlement he was aware of. Both findings were filed without further action. Neither finding has appeared in any published account of the gorge's history. And the 1906 Corps report spent decades misfiled under the wrong project designation in a federal archive. in a folder bearing no external marking to suggest it contained anything other than routine survey data. What was lost at Niagara may be irrecoverable. The Robert Moses Niagara Power Plant project of the 1950s redirected enormous volumes of water and altered the flow dynamics of both falls substantially. The 1969 core dewatering project may have covered the sections Thurber described, or may have left them intact beneath new material. There is no way to know without going back, and there is no funded proposal to go back that I have been able to locate. What was lost with certainty is the opportunity the 1906 survey created. The opportunity to ask the question properly, in public, with the full capacity of early 20th century science behind it, at a moment when the features were documented and physically accessible. That window closed when the routing slip was canceled and the billing file was folded away. It has not reopened since. We are comfortable, as a culture, with the idea that we don't know everything about the ancient world. We are less comfortable with the specific version of that idea, which is that evidence of what we don't know has sometimes been found, documented by credentialed observers, and then filed in a way that ensured it would not be examined further, not destroyed, not actively suppressed in a dramatic sense, just placed in a folder, under the wrong project number, in a building full of folders, and left there. That is a quieter kind of erasure, and in some ways it is more durable than destruction, because it requires no conspiracy. It requires only the ordinary human tendency to put away what cannot be immediately explained, and to trust that someone else, later with better tools, will deal with it. No one did. Not in 1906. Not in 1908, not in 1931, not in 1969. If you know someone who has stood at the rail above Niagara Falls and felt, underneath the spectacle, some older weight to the place that the tourist signs don't account for, share this with them. The surveys exist. The letters exist. The misfiled folder exists. The question was asked more than a century ago, and the only honest answer anyone gave was the one Captain Thurber put on page 17. We are not in a position to offer an alternative explanation. Neither am I. But now, at least, you know the question was asked.